Welcome to Microbiology 4423, Antibiotics and Antibiotic Resistance. Today we are all living in the antibiotic age. That means that you got your first dose of antibiotics a few minutes after you were born with antibiotic eye drops put into your eyes. It means that when we go outside, we don't worry about scratching ourselves in the garden on a rose bush and then dying of a horrible infection. It means that an upper respiratory infection is no big deal. It means that today our life expectancy is almost 80 years, whereas 100 years ago, it was only 53. Just how recently the antibiotic age began might surprise you. We were all born in the antibiotic age. My parents only just made it by a year or two. My grandparents were born before the antibiotic age, which really started with the development of penicillin, the first real antibiotic in 1945. It was the first miracle drug, something that people had not anticipated before in science fiction or in their wildest imagination, a drug that would really cure somebody in almost no time at all. The advent of antibiotics really ushered in a totally new era of medicine. In fact, it not only transformed, it really built the modern drug industry as we know it today. But how did we get to the antibiotic age? What was life like before? What had to happen for us to get there? What was medicine like before the antibiotic age? The whole enterprise of medicine is to diagnose a disease and then have some kind of a treatment that fits the disease. So the first thing that a physician does is to look at the symptoms of a disease in order to deduce the cause of the disease. And then, ideally, the doctor treats the cause of the disease to make the symptoms go away. But oftentimes we also treat the symptoms themselves to give a patient relief if the cause of the disease cannot be directly treated. So ideally, the treatment will fit the cause. A doctor's treatment is based on what he or she thinks the cause of the disease is. Now, today we know that infectious diseases from hepatitis to the common cold to COVID-19 are caused by microorganisms, infectious microorganisms. But we did not always know that. In fact, it was not until 1890, same year OSU was founded, that the germ theory of disease gained traction in the field of medicine. Now, more on that in a moment. So people literally, for hundreds and hundreds of years, overlooked microorganisms as a cause of disease simply because we couldn't see them. They were too small. So other theories for disease had to be developed to explain why people got sick. Maybe the most famous of the pre-germ theories of disease was the four humors hypothesis, which was formulated in about 150 AD by a Greco-Roman physician named Galen. In the four humors hypothesis, diseases were caused by an imbalance among four humors in the human body. Humors is another word for fluids. These four fluids were thought to be blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And so if someone was sick, it was because those humors were out of balance. In fact, we still use that word today. Sometimes we say that somebody is in good humor, and that's sort of a throwback to the four humors hypothesis. So if somebody was sick because their humors were out of balance, one way to try to make them well again would be to bring those fluids back in balance. And that led to aggressive treatments like bloodletting or giving somebody an emetic, which is something that makes you vomit, to get rid of some of those humors and bring them back into balance. Otherwise, people tried to just make their patients comfortable. They would apply palliative care to make somebody comfortable if they couldn't afford those aggressive interventions to try to fix the four humors. Now, this four humors hypothesis held sway for centuries, all the way up until the 19th century, in fact. To give you one example, consider the death of George Washington. Beloved father of his country, he died on December 14th, 1799. Looking back at it today, we think that he probably died of a throat infection caused by the bacterium Haemophilus influenzae. But his doctors, the best that were available to anybody, came and they bled him aggressively, perhaps bleeding him of over half his blood volume. They put an irritating paste on his neck to raise blisters that then they could pop and get rid of those fluids. He was given mercurious chloride as an emetic to make him vomit. He was given an enema. Bran paste was put on his legs. He gargled molasses and vinegar and butter. They were doing everything they could to put those humors back in balance. But is it any wonder that he died that night? Remember, the treatment for a disease is designed to fit your theory of disease. And in this case, they were aiming at the wrong thing. Not microorganisms, but the four humors. Now, the true cause of infectious disease, microorganisms, even before they were discovered or visualized by man, were theorized about for thousands of years through theories of contagion. For example, it was noticed even in centuries BC that diseases would spread from person to person. You can read in ancient Hebrew scriptures in Leviticus and Numbers how people with leprosy or with open sores were commanded to stay outside, to quarantine themselves and wash. Other observers noticed that, by analogy to plants, that seeds of disease seemed to spread. In fact, in the 15th or 16th centuries, it was noticed that inanimate objects called fomites, blankets, clothing from diseased people, would be able to cause disease sometime later. So, coexisting with the four humors hypothesis, another theory developed, and it developed as early as the 4th century BC, and this was the idea of bad air that would cause disease, that you could take in bad air and breathe in these seeds of disease and then get sick. And the Greek word for pollution or polluted air is miasma, so it was called the miasma theory that dictated that breathing in bad air would cause you to get sick. And in fact, we still have vestiges of that in our language today. We still have a disease called malaria, which means bad air. All this remained theoretical until microorganisms were first directly seen. And that wasn't until the 17th century when Dutch businessman and scientist Antony van Leeuwenhoek, he noticed that there are these little tiny organisms, things moving around. He called them wee animalcules in his microscope. And that laid the foundation for connecting the existence of microorganisms with disease. Even after van Leeuwenhoek saw bacteria in his microscope, it would still be many, many decades before people realized that microorganisms were the cause of disease. Miasma theory still held sway for a lot of the 18th and even the 19th centuries. Now, a turning point in the debate between germ theory and miasma theory occurred in the mid-19th century with the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak in London. Now, there was the first epidemiologist, perhaps, John Snow, was studying this phenomenon. He was studying water quality in the great city of London. And so the River Thames comes through London, and different water companies would draw water from the river to have people drink. And we also use the river, or Londoners also use the river, to dump their sewage. And so sometimes, depending on where different companies would draw their water, people would get sick with cholera, as you may know, is because it's transmitted from the fecal-oral route. Yeah? So he was studying cholera outbreaks, and he thought that the germ theory of disease was correct. And there was this outbreak of cholera in London around this place called Broad Street. And what he did inadvertently is the first modern epidemiological study where he went around and asked people at their houses whether people had fallen ill with cholera and which water pump they used to get their water from. And it turns out that everybody who got sick all drew their water from this one water pump on Broad Street, which, as it turned out, had been dug only a few feet away from an old cesspit. They removed the handle from that water pump, and then it fixed the outbreak. So that was a lot of evidence in favor of the germ theory of disease, and it's also considered now the first ever epidemiology experiment done. As all this evidence mounted, by the late 19th century, Robert Koch, German scientist, was in a good position to publish his germ theory of disease and his 4 postulates. And Koch's postulates were designed to connect a particular microorganism with a particular disease. And here were his 4 postulates. The first one is you could isolate the microorganism from diseased individuals, but not from healthy ones. Second, you could take that microorganism and grow it in the lab in isolation. Third, you could take the organism that you grew in the lab, infect an animal, not a person, with it, and that animal would fall sick with the same disease that the original subject had, and then you could re-isolate the same bacterium or the same microorganism from the now diseased individual. So those are Koch's 4 postulates, which are designed to show the germ theory of disease, really highlight that germs are the cause, or microorganisms are the cause of disease. Now, the establishment of the germ theory, that's changed everything, because you remember, theory of treatment depends on the theory of disease. And if diseases are caused by microorganisms, not by bad air or by an imbalance among the four humors. Now, the treatment would be to try to get rid of that microorganism. So scientists began searching for compounds that would be able to kill or stop the growth of bacteria. Now, there were a few successes during the first couple decades of the 20th century, finding antimicrobial compounds. But one of them was a drug known as sulfanilamide, which is still used today, or derivatives of it are still used today, and they're so-called sulfa drugs. So it's sort of the longest used antibiotic, now in use for more than 80 years. But those early drugs were nothing like the potency and the amazing curative effect that would be achieved with the first true antibiotic, which I consider to be penicillin. A true antibiotic has two essential features. First, it kills or stops the growth of bacteria, and second, it doesn't harm the human host. So it truly does aim at the cause of infectious disease, getting rid of bacteria while leaving us alone. And it was Alexander Fleming who had the wherewithal to notice that a mold called Penicillium notatum produced a secretion that would be able to kill or stop the growth of bacteria while not harming people. And that was his major contribution to notice that. It took an additional team of 3 scientists, Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and Norman Heatley, and another almost 15 years to develop penicillin to the point where it could be produced at an industrial scale so that ordinary people could finally get it. We'll talk a lot more about that story and about, indeed, the golden age of antibiotics in future classes. But I'd like to end today with the story of the first patient who was fully cured with penicillin. Before the antibiotic age, giving birth was a bit of a dicey proposition. And Mrs. Ann Miller miscarried on Valentine's Day, 1942. She developed streptococcal septicemia, bacteria in her blood. She had a fever of 106. The technician who counted the bacteria in her blood just wrote an infinity symbol on her chart because there were too many bacteria to count. She was going to die that night. Now, her doctor, a guy named John Bumstead, he had another patient in the hospital who was friends with Howard Florey, the penicillin guy. And somehow he managed to pull enough strings to get half the United States supply of penicillin at that time, which was really only 5.5 grams. He made up an administration protocol. He took the penicillin he got, dissolved it in saline, and began administering it to Mrs. Miller intravenously. By the next day, her fever was at 99. She was eating. She lived for 57 more years. She was only the 5th person to be given penicillin and the first person to be given enough for it truly to be a life-saving treatment. And I emphasize that nobody saw this coming. This was as close to a miracle drug as anybody could have imagined. And nobody thought that there could be drugs like this. And you probably experienced this yourself. If you've taken antibiotics when you're sick as a dog and you start taking them and by the next day you're feeling yourself again, that sort of power of medicine was really ushered into humankind through antibiotics. And we'll talk in future lectures about the history of antimicrobial development, about the discovery of antibiotics, about the golden age of antibiotic development in the 1940s and 1950s, where class after class of antibiotics was discovered. We'll classify those antibiotics by their structures and by their mechanisms of action. We'll talk about how bacteria fight back against antibiotics and resist antibiotic action, and how we, in turn, fight back against their resistance. We'll talk about economic considerations of bringing new antibiotics to market, how antibiotics are used not only for humans, but also in agriculture. And we'll survey the current situation and talk about the prospects for future antibiotic development. I'll look forward to every lecture.